Hello, hello, hello. It's module 3. All right. After module 2 being so long and arduous to get through, I thought we would go back to something that we all are very familiar with as writers, and that is perspective. And as it turns out, perspective is a huge part about that involved in designing your story's voice. Perspective is let's see if I can remember all of them off the top of my head and not look at my notes. First person, second person, third person limited, third person omniscient. Is that them? Yeah, I think so. And by the way, in second person, there's also singular and plural. I've only seen one book that ever did second person plural. So instead of it being they, no, it was they. So first singular, second person is you, and then second person plural is they. And it was a book called And Then There Were None. And it was so entertaining and amazing. And it absolutely made the book. It was about an office that had changed management, but no information was coming from, the higher ups. Just I don't know, day after day they would show up to the office to work, and there would be changes that had happened, and then people stopped showing up, and it was about the paranoia of not receiving, I don't know, facts and information. And yeah, I'll leave it to you to go read the ending for it, because it's really quite unnerving. And there was something about this second person plural that made it so that you were part of the office team that was increasingly paranoid and increasingly fraught with tension, and the infighting, and it just created this collusion. Ahaha. And that, my friends, is the heart of what you're looking for in perspective, in picking the right one for your book, is knowing how inclusive you want your reader to be in the psychology of things, because sometimes the denial of information can be really powerful, which we'll see when we work a little bit with third person reportage or omniscient. But sometimes the whole point of it is to be as close inside the emotional ride of things as possible, which is what we usually see in first person. So that's what we're looking at today. And I've got some examples for us to look at. Yeah, shall we just dive into it? Let's play a little bit here. So first person perspective creates an instant intimacy. And it's what most modern books are written in, and by modern I mean two things. One, contemporary books, books written about our contemporary time, but also books that are written now by writers now. There seemed to have been a shift for a long time. It was third person, and it was third person omniscient. And now it just seems that readers really, really want to have that I experience so they can really put themselves into the story. YAs, for example, you very rarely, well, not rarely, but you mostly, I would say 80% of the books in young adult are going to be first person. And that makes total sense, right? Because teenagers are, they're just coming into their self-awareness. So they're very self-focused. They need to go through that period where they're really, really studying themselves. So the I just makes a perfect match for them, because they're more adept than anybody at really putting themselves into the story, and the I becomes a vehicle for that. Obviously, autobiographies and memoirs for our friends who are doing creative nonfiction. Memoirs have to be in the first person. They just do. Although it would be super interesting if it was about somebody who was neurodivergent and were disassociated, to see them speaking of themselves in the third person. I mean, it could work, right? It could be part of the build, because then you're sort of capturing what that disassociation feels like for the reader. So, we're starting to see that selection of the perspective isn't automatic. I do feel like a lot of of writers sort of automatically go to first person, or they automatically go to first person for themselves, and then other writers will automatically go to third person limited for themselves. And I'm just gonna, we're gonna break these down, and then we're gonna play and see what the functionality might be. See if there's something else out there that might be fun for you to work on. Let's see here. In first person, it is important to remember that we need to have complete access to what that character's thoughts are. It's not fair to deny us information, to give it to us sometimes, then other times be like, no, I'm just not going to reveal that piece. Nope, those are breaking the rules. First person means we get full access unless the character is unreliable, in which case we catch on pretty quick that this person is denying us all kinds of information, is manipulating things, is reframing things the way they want us to see it, which can be really, really fun. Unreliable narrators drive some of the best books ever written in America. We're going to look at one. It's called The Great Gatsby. Let's see here. Romance, really super functional in first person. In fact, it's kind of weird to do, the pronouns he, she, they in romance, because again, we're there for the emotional ride. So first person seems to work best. Sci-fi fantasy, you can go in lots of directions here, but first person really functions well. And horror also, because we're trying to close the gap between the reader and the character's emotional experience. So in horror, first person, oh my gosh, can be really, really terrifying. Not necessary, but we're just, again, looking at the functionality. Okay, so I'm going to give you an example. This is from a book called I, Claudius by Robert Graves. I, Tiberius, Claudius, Nero, Germanicus, this, that, or the other, for I shall not trouble you yet with all of my titles, who was once, and not so long ago either, known to my friends and relatives and associates as Claudius the idiot, or that Claudius, or Claudius the stammerer, or Claudius, or at best, poor Uncle Claudius. I'm now about to write the strange history of my life, starting from my earliest childhood and continuing year by year until I reach the fateful point of change where, some 8 years ago, at the age of 51, I suddenly found myself caught in what I may call the golden predicament, from which I have never since become untangled. One of the things that first person is really effective at is well, lots of things, but we are able to tap in right away to how they feel about the way they move through the world and the way that they are perceived. They're obviously pretty grumpy about it. Now, what's very interesting is Claudius has a stammer, but not when he's thinking to himself. There's nothing wrong with this person's brain. And it creates a great friction between, again, how he interacts externally with the world and how he interacts with us. He is making his stand directly to us. We are his only audience, really. And there's a little bit of sort of meta here, because he is aware that as he says, he is writing about his life. So he is framing things for us. He's aware that he is framing the story, and he is in full and complete control. We had talked a little bit about the idea of a conversational voice, like different kinds of voices. This is very conversational, but not Robert Graves, the author's conversational voice. This is Claudius's conversational voice that happens in his head. And how fun to write like this, don't you think? We get the sense that there's definitely like history here. We're not able right away in only a paragraph to orient exactly where we are. But when he comes in with the Tiberius, Claudius, Nero, Germanicus, this, that, or the other, we are thinking, oh, that's got to be Roman. That's got to be Roman Empire times. It kind of gives us a little clue right away. Lots of things functioning here. This is a smart guy, and there's lots of things blocking him from being out into the world as he would like to be out in the world. All of that from a single paragraph. Not bad, super fun. Now, they're not, first person tomes are not always that complicated, but keep in mind that the first person is always somebody who is framing the story, and they're going to tell it to us in a way that they want us to know, regardless of whether or not they're speaking directly to us. They're kind of breaking that fourth wall, or if it is a little bit more of a passive experience. I had already talked a little bit about second person, which is the you/we. This also creates a lot of intimacy, but in sort of in a not quite jarring way, but it's weird. We're just not used to it. So we never quite settle completely into the reading of it. It takes us a long time to adapt to it. But again, you're doing it for a purpose. So I'm going to give you two examples of this. One is Jay McInerney. I can never say his name, McInerney. Anyway, Bright Lights, Big City, a book that many of you may very well be familiar with back from the 90s. You're not the kind of guy who would be at a place like this at this time of the morning, but here you are, and you cannot say the terrain is entirely unfamiliar, although the details are fuzzy. You are at a nightclub talking to a girl with a shaved head. The club is either Heartbreak or the Lizard Lounge. All might become clear if you could just slip into the bathroom. Then again, it might not. A small voice inside you insists that this epidemic lack of clarity is a result of too much clubbing already. Ha ha ha. So there's one perception of this where it behaves kind of like first person, but it also feels really judgy. Fun. As it turns out, our character here is a drug addict and loses lots of time. Is high a lot. So using the second person for them is kind of terrific because we were talking about disassociation, right? This guy's pretty disassociated. So that dictation ends up being really functional for us to get the information that we need in order to understand what the heck is happening. All right, this is another bit from one of that book that I talked about, Jennifer Egan's A Visit from the Goon Squad, the Pulitzer Prize winning one that everybody should check out of their library and read. Let's see here. You slip through Sasha's open window. You kneel beside her, breathing in the familiar smell of Sasha's sleep, whispering into her ear some mix of, I'm sorry, and I believe in you, and I'll always be near you, protecting you, and I will never leave you. I'll be curled around your heart for the rest of your life until the water pressing my shoulders and chest crushes me awake, and I hear Sasha screaming into my face, fight, fight, fight. Wow, what just happened there? We went from second person into first person, and it was so seamless. It was in the same paragraph, the same sentence. So I don't know if you were quite tracking this, but this was somebody who was drowning. They were a ghost. You slip through Sasha's open window. You kneel beside her. Yeah, and then we find out. So then they're whispering into Sasha's ear, and it's kind of creepy because they're basically announcing, I'm going to haunt you. And then they are brought back into their body, back into the first person. And Sasha is, in fact, trying to, do CPR and bring this person back to life. So tricky, but oh my gosh, I just wanted to open a window about how really, really dynamic perspective can be for you, and hopefully invite you to come and play. All right, so there's three different kinds of third person. This is the he, she, they. It's also the first one we're going to talk about is objective third person, also called the dramatic point of view. So the trick on this one, where first person and second person have tons and tons of interiority. So again, those inner thoughts of your character, this doesn't have any. Zero. Think of it like a camera that is just recording what can be seen and what can be heard, i.e. dialogue or sound effects happening, but that camera has zero access to their processing, their emotional life, any thoughts about the future, any flashbacks or memories. Nope, all we have is what we see and what we hear. So it's kind of like screenwriting. If you will. All right, so this is Ernest Hemingway, and he wrote almost all of his stuff in this dramatic third person dramatic point of view. It was kind of his shtick. I'm giving Hemingway a shtick, but you know what I mean. This was his jam. It was very effective for him and the way that he wanted to tell his story. This is one that I think all of us had to read way back in high school. And I'm bringing this one forward, one, because Hemingway, who does it better, but also because we just don't see a lot of this anymore. Again, modern audiences are really in it for the emotional ride, and when we're not being given access to the emotions, it's less satisfying for us. Reportage, we see a lot in creative nonfiction when it's on the more journalistic side of things versus the storytelling side of things. So this might come in handy for the creative nonfiction who are working in that space. All right, so hills like white elephants. The hills across the valley of Eberl were long and white. On this side, there was no shade and no trees, and the station was between two lines of rails in the sun. Close against the side of the station, there was the warm shadow of the building and a curtain made of strings of bamboo beads hung across the open door into the bar to keep out flies. The American and the girl with him sat at a table in the shade outside the building. It was very hot, and the express from Barcelona would come in 40 minutes. It stopped at this junction for 2 minutes and went on to Madrid. "What do you think we should drink?" the girl asked. She had taken off her hat and put it on the table. "It's pretty hot," said the man. "Let's drink beer." "Dos cervezas," the man said into the curtain. "Big ones?" the woman asked from the doorway. "Yes, two big ones." The woman brought two glasses of beer and two felt pads. She put the felt pads and the beer glasses on the table and looked at the man and the girl. The girl was looking off at the line of hills. They were white in the sun, and the country was brown and dry. "They look like white elephants," she said. All right, you tell me what this is about. It's very hard to tell right away. There's only a few cues in here, the American and the girl. Turns out she's not a girl. She is a woman. So whose perspective is it that this is a girl? When I think girl, I think, under 18, I think child. But here the woman is the woman who is bringing them beverages. And I love that little code switch where the man says dos cervezas. He's speaking in the language of the people there. And she switches, or she doesn't switch, she speaks to him in English, which is this terrific, little trick like, "Oh, you're not one of us. Let's just speak in your language. It'll be easier for everyone." Anyway, not a lot of well, I'm sorry, all the subtext is going on, but you would need to read more to really understand the dynamics between these two. I do always feel like the location is hugely important. So they're at a train station, and train station is, of course, about travel, but they're not traveling yet. They are waiting. They are waiting to travel. So these are two people who are kind of in an in-between place, if you will. Who knows if both of them are going to get on that train? Who knows if anybody's going to get on that train? This is the only bit of suspense that we have at the moment is what are these two here for? So yeah, and it's a short story. So go have a peek at this one and you can see just what Ernest Hemingway was up to. Again, it's not a kind of storytelling device that a lot of people respond to. It can be tricky because we're so used to having access and giving access to our characters, but it can be really fun to play with because it puts even more weight on the props, on the clothes, on the location, and obviously the location is hugely important. The dry brown country and the hills that look like white elephants. Ooh la la. All right, moving on, moving on. Third person is close, also known as third person limited or third person subjective. Now, this is the one that behaves just exactly like first person, but we're just switching into the pronouns that your main character uses. So he, she, they. Um, it's the same level of intimacy. It's the same level of access as third person. We are just limited to that character's point of view, though. It's no fair to go hopping around into other people's heads just because we're in third person. we have to wait for like a section break to do that. If we are hopping in a single paragraph, we start off with one character writing from their perspective, and then by the end of the paragraph, we hop into another character's perspective. That's called head hopping, and it's very confusing for the reader. And let me repeat that. No head hopping. Pick one character to do your third person, limited, subjective, close, whatever you want to call it, and then stick with that point of view until there's a moment where there's like a section break, and then you can hop over to somebody else's point of view. And then it is, again, exclusively that person's point of view. It's just not worth it to try to train our audience to know that they're going to be here, they're going to be there, they're going to be here, they're going to be there. Super confusing. Now, that said, I can think of 4 or 5 books that do this, but they're written by people like Philip Pullman, Golden Compass, for example, and they're above my pay grade. I can't do what he does. So you may see it sometimes, but I just want you to take a look at it and be like, well, why is the writer doing this? Why are they giving us access to everybody's perspective, for a few paragraphs here and then hopping over here with another character's perspective? And I'm not going to answer that question because it's a different answer depending on the book. They designed that voice in order to carry certain kinds of messaging that way. All right. Lots of folks, lots of writers, if they're not first person writers, they're third person close writers. And it's kind of the same thing. But then you go back to the genre and say, okay, if it's YA or if it's romance or memoir, obviously that goes without saying, then the thinking is, I need to just take out all the he, she, theys, and I need to put in the I, we. All right, let's talk about third person omniscient. So this is when you have a character who it's kind of the author is a character. There's somebody who can literally see and hear everything, everybody's thoughts, everybody's contemplations and rationales, and they can move at will between different characters, but it's because they have established that there is a narrator who is holding everything together. This is still a really popular point of view. Historical can really, really benefit from this. You see this a ton in fantasy, especially medieval slash high slash epic fantasy, and also in sci-fi. Sometimes it's because we're hopping around lots of different places. So it's like we're going to need to be able to go to lots of different characters' points of view. And then, what happens when they all come together? It also gives how would I put this? When you have a narrator, there's like a capital N narrator. We were talking about Douglas Adams in a different module. He definitely is in there as, hi, I'm Douglas Adams, and I'm going to be your storyteller today. Once upon a time. And he's giving his thoughts and his perspectives on everything that's happening. So we actually have more access to the narrator's perspective than we do the characters. And we come to understand that the characters are just one more narrative device, the same as the setting, same as the plot points, that we're not meant to grow deeply attached to the characters. We're meant to kind of take this almost intellectual ride with our narrator. Another example of this, the Book Thief, which is genius. Everybody needs to read The Book Thief. I know it's YA, but trust me on this. It's written from the perspective of Death himself. So it's a narrator with a capital N. Also, you sometimes hear this called the bardic narrator, which calls back to the times when we actually had bards who went from village to village passing on the news of things that are happening elsewhere in the world. Now, granted, the bard got paid to write the story, so don't trust the bard. The bard is writing the story that he was paid to write and to sing about and to take around, but there's still going to be kernels of truth in there, right? So bardic narrators are not necessarily folks to trust, but they end up being our main character. So the tendency is to assign the same emotional engagement with them as we you would with a first person or a third person close. Fun, right? All right, so I'm going to give you an example of that. This is Snow Falling on Cedars, Dave Gutterson. The accused man, Kabuo Miyamoto, sat proudly upright with a rigid grace, his palms placed softly on the defendant's table, the posture of a man who has detached himself insofar as this is possible at his own trial. Some in the gallery would say later that his stillness suggested a disdain for the proceedings. Others felt certain that it veiled a fear of the verdict that was to come. Whatever it was, Kabuo showed nothing, not even a flicker in the eyes. Now, here's the amazing thing about this. This is third person omniscient, but we zoom in close, but then we come back out and we actually have access to the people in the jury, but not individuals in the jury. The author has broken them into like units. So some had this thought and some had that thought, but it's still zooming in close into their perspective and reading their minds. So delightfully entertaining. Now, the whole book doesn't go on and on like this, but this was a section. So if you think of it in terms of I don't know, like a movie camera, the first shot would be, you know, over here with our defendant sitting at that table, sitting proudly, you know, which is a close. It's a judgment call, right? It's an emotional insight. He was sitting proudly at the table with rigid grace. But then when we zoom out, has detached himself insofar as this is possible at his own trial. That's actually the narrator with a capital N speaking. And then some in the gallery would later say his stillness suggested a disdain. So this is now zooming into this group of the juror and then the other perspective. Oh, so fun. Now, you don't have to make it this complicated for yourself. But now, if you hadn't already been paying attention to these kinds of things, now you know how they work and then why they get chosen to be used. All right, I'm going to read from Seed to Harvest, Octavia Butler. Ha ha ha, some more sci-fi, ladies and gentlemen. And this is first person, but she does some really interesting things in here. So here we go. Rachel told Doro, not me, that I had been right, that she could heal now without taking strength from a crowd. In fact, she said she wasn't sure she could still draw enough strength from crowds. She said the pattern had changed her, limited her somehow. Now she seemed to be using her patient's own strength to heal them, which sounded as though it would be dangerous if her patient was in bad shape to start with. Jessie had merely eaten a couple of steaks when she let him wake up. Steaks, a lot of fries, salad, and about a quart of milk. But Jessie was such a big guy that I suspected that that was the way he usually ate. I found out later that I was right. So evidently, the healing hadn't weakened him that much. I kept to myself during those first days. I watched everybody, read everybody, that is. I found that Rachel had spread the word about my abilities, and everyone figured I was watching them. They didn't like it. They thought a lot of stuff at me when I was in a room with them, but I also never read them steadily when I was with them, talking to them. I had to keep my attention on what they were saying. So it took me a while to realize that I was being cursed out on two levels. I was settling in, though. I was learning not to be afraid of any of them, not even Carl. They were all older than I was, and they were all physically bigger. For a while, I had to keep telling myself I couldn't afford to let that matter. After a while, I started to convince myself that I would be able to handle them. About 800 things happening in those three paragraphs. So the first thing we pick up, so Octavia writes fantasy sci-fi. One of the things I think that you picked up in here is that she read them. So that could be just somebody who is, an empath and is particularly good at picking up on, facial cues and bodily cues, or it could be that she's psychic. We have another person who is a healer but draws energy in order to heal. So this is another form of psychic powers. This is somebody who's an energy healer. So without coming right out and saying it, we're just being given that world building information that this is the world that we're in. And what's so fascinating is Octavia goes between different perspectives almost in every line. There's a different perspective that we're being given because she was able to to read somebody's mind and to be able to tell us what it was that they were thinking. I'm just going to read that opening bit just a little bit, so that we can pull it apart. Rachel Tordoro, not me, that I had been right. So this isn't psychic. This is just secondhand information. That apparently Doro passed it on. Anyway, that she could heal now without taking strength from a crowd. In fact, she said she wasn't sure she could still draw strength. She said, so this is all non-psychic accruing of information, not first person from our character witnessing it, but having been told it. So that's already like creating layers of distancing, of narrative distancing. It wasn't a direct experience of hers, but it's still information that she has. And then I want to go to, I love it. So I suspected Jesse was such a big guy. I suspected that this is how he ate anyway. I found out later that I was right. So then we're also getting a skewing of time. So like, when are these thoughts happening? And she's looking back on them. And then she even includes a little piece of a different timeline into that moment. And then we have, I watched everybody, read everybody. That is, everybody knew that I was watching them and they didn't like it and they were thinking bad things about me when I was in a room with them, but I wasn't actually listening to them when I was in a room with them. So she's giving like the rules of her powers, but she's also giving us the insight about how, like the conflict that's happening between these people. By the way, they haven't had a conversation yet. Nothing untoward has actually happened yet. It's just that these people don't like having a psychic crawling around in their heads. And she hasn't bothered to tell them that it just doesn't work that way. Super fun. So doing the zooming in and out worked really perfectly for a character that had these powers. So also be thinking, those of you who write fantasy and delve into the magical world, think about what kind of perspective might help tell the story and how to make use of the information that's happening in all of the different characters that are all over the place, and how do you bring that information in. And this is first person, as you I'm sure picked up. So when you're first person, you're kind of chained just to that person's experience. It's just no fair to go diving into other people's heads if your character's not a psychic, right? So you have to figure out how to get that other information out. And usually it's dialogue. And sometimes you'll see something like this in first person. I'm willing to guess that they were thinking about. And that's fine. But if you do that too much, the reader kind of gets, I don't know, they start flagging it and they realize, oh, the writer wants me to have that information. So they're doing it in kind of the shoehorn way, and it becomes less artful. So you're always looking for other ways to pull in other information. Ernest does it through subtext, and Octavia Butler does it through psychic powers. How fun. All right, so that is plenty for today. Let's switch over to our homework for module 3. We've got one more module after this, and then I'll see you at the library. So homework for module 3 is, take 4 to 8 pages of your own writing And then, I don't know, have some fun with it. Pick a different perspective that you aren't writing in, and maybe even the one that's the hardest for you to write in, and go ahead and change the perspective just to have the experience. I'm not saying that you're going to change the perspective, but sometimes if we don't play, we don't know what's available to us. I've had some people who really, really, really were struggling writing their book, and they had the plot all sorted out, and they could talk for days about the characters, and something just wasn't clicking for them. So I would have them go write in a different perspective, and all of a sudden they're like, well, that was it. It turns out I was writing in the wrong perspective. That wasn't right for the voice of my story. All right. Oh, and then do I want to do that? I'm going to skip number one. Yeah, we're going to skip that. We're just going to stick to changing the perspective. All right. So that's it for module 3. I will see you over in module 4, and then we will be kind of a wrap, y'all. Cheers.